Welcome to the debate. Today we are tackling something that frustrates millions of adults around the world, the fundamental mechanisms of adult second language acquisition. Specifically, how do we actually achieve true speaking fluency? It is a massive challenge, and the pedagogical world is deeply divided on the best approach.
It really is. I mean, you have busy professionals, university students, expats, all sinking thousands of hours into trying to reach that elusive state of fluency. And so often, they just hit a wall. They study for years and still freeze up when they actually have to speak.
Right, and we are framing our discussion today around the central disagreement at the heart of that frustration. Does fluency primarily emerge from explicit, structured learning of rules, grammar, and rehearsed sentence structures? Or does it develop subconsciously through immersive, context-driven exposure and the procedural acquisition of what linguists call comprehensible input?
Well, to lay my cards on the table right away, I lean heavily toward the idea that immersive exposure, emotional context, and communication-driven phrase mining are the true, biologically aligned drivers of language acquisition. I believe we learn language best when we aren't consciously trying to learn it.
And coming from the other side, I firmly maintain that explicit instruction, structured daily routines, and the conscious, deliberate practice of specific linguistic forms are absolutely essential. Without that framework, the adult learner is just spinning their wheels. Let's get right into it. When we talk about adult learners, we cannot treat their brains like those of toddlers. Adults have highly developed cognitive filters. We want to know why something works. Relying purely on subconscious acquisition, just letting the language wash over you and hoping it sticks, is deeply flawed for a mature brain.
Flawed in what sense? You don't think adults can absorb language naturally?
Not efficiently, no. If you just wait for language to absorb into your subconscious, you become incredibly vulnerable to cognitive biases. The classic example in the literature is the Baader-Meinhof effect. This is the frequency illusion. You learn a new word or you notice a phrase for the first time, and suddenly you hear it everywhere. You falsely equate that mere recognition with the ability to actually produce the word accurately in real time. But recognition is totally passive. To cross the bridge from passive recognition to active production, you need conscious practice of specific sentence structures. I am talking about mastering highly functional, native-like chunks, phrases like be bound to, so to speak, or do you mind if. You have to write these sentences out. You have to practice them consciously. And crucially, you have to seek explicit correction from a proficient speaker. A disciplined, structured approach, like a dedicated 15-minute daily routine of reading aloud, warming up the mouth, and practicing sounds, is the most reliable path to mastery.
I see the appeal of that structure, especially for busy adults who want a neat checklist, but I come at this from a completely different angle. Language isn't a declarative set of facts to be memorized. It is a procedural skill. Think about it like riding a bicycle. You can memorize all the declarative physics of balance, torque, and momentum. That is your traditional grammar drill. But knowing the physics doesn't mean you can ride the bike. You have to get on it and feel the procedural mechanics. My position is that traditional grammar drills and explicit routines merely teach you about the language, whereas immersive, context-dependent exposure teaches you the language itself.
But surely, you still need to know where the brakes are before you start pedaling down a hill.
Sure, but you learn the brakes by using them in context, not by studying a diagram of the brake pads. I rely heavily on the modern iterations of Stephen Krashen's input hypothesis. True fluency is not achieved through rote memorization of rules, because conscious rules simply fail us during the cognitive overload of a real-time conversation. You don't have the hundreds of milliseconds required to compute a grammar rule before you open your mouth to speak. Instead, true fluency is achieved by capturing whole, context-rich sentences from native content using the N+1 rule.
Let's define that for our listeners. N+1 just means you understand everything in a sentence except for one target concept, right?
Exactly. So if N is your current knowledge base, the +1 is the single new word or grammar structure you are trying to learn. Imagine a puzzle missing just one piece. You can figure out what that piece looks like based on all the surrounding pieces. The cognitive load is incredibly light. When you mine phrases like this from compelling media, a TV show, a podcast, a novel, you utilize emotional hooks and episodic context to cement the language into long-term procedural memory.
Okay, let's dive into that tension between accuracy and fluency, which really brings us to our first major point of contention, the role of explicit grammar instruction. You champion immersive and communicative approaches, but let's look at the data. A recent comparative study out of Shanghai looked at this exact thing. They pitted the pure communicative language teaching approach, CLT, against the traditional grammar translation method. The key takeaway? If you only focus on communicating and ignore the formal rules, you hit a hard ceiling.
A ceiling in what regard?
In structural accuracy and reading comprehension, while the communicative approach is wonderful for building basic interaction and general sociolinguistic confidence, the study is clear that the traditional approach remains highly effective and arguably necessary for enhancing grammatical knowledge. Without focused grammar frameworks, learners simply lack accuracy. They might be communicating, sure. They might successfully order a meal or buy a train ticket, but they are often fossilizing incorrect patterns.
Let's talk about fossilization because I think it's often misunderstood.
Well, in this context, fossilizing means cementing bad habits permanently. It is like a golfer who never took a single lesson and just kept swinging. They might occasionally hit the ball down the fairway, but their swing is fundamentally flawed. And after 10,000 swings, that physical flaw is permanently fossilized. An over-reliance on task-based learning without explicit grammatical foundations leaves the learner with a permanent handicap on their proficiency.
That is a compelling argument, but have you considered the massive psychological toll of prioritizing that kind of accuracy over communicative flow? An overemphasis on explicit grammar creates a massive mental barrier. It literally freezes learners in real-time conversations. Think about the physical symptoms. We have all been there. You are trying to order a coffee in Paris or Tokyo. You know the exact grammar rule from your textbook, but suddenly your mind goes totally blank. Your palms are sweating, your heart races, and you just point at the pastry and grunt.
Well, that is just an initial affective filter. It's a stage of nervousness that passes with practice.
Why does it happen in the first place? It happens because the learner is absolutely terrified of making a structural mistake in front of a native speaker. They are desperately trying to run your declarative grammar rules through their head, checking gender, conjugation, verb tense, while simultaneously trying to maintain basic social engagement. It is simply too much processing power.
The psychological data and modern pedagogical frameworks emphasize a vital mindset shift. Mistakes are data, not disasters.
I don't disagree that fear is an obstacle, but I argue the cure for that fear is competence. Competence born of structure, not just ignoring the errors and hoping for the best.
Is a trap. English, or any language, is a tool for communication. It is not a standardized test. If you are constantly monitoring your speech for explicit rule compliance, you trigger the exact hesitation that ruins fluency. What differentiates a highly fluent speaker from a hesitant one isn't the total absence of mistakes. It is communicative resilience.
Communicative resilience. Explain how you see that playing out.
It is the ability to keep going, to self-correct naturally on the fly, and to not let a dropped verb conjugation derail the entire exchange. The explicit grammar approach breeds a perfectionism that is the mortal enemy of this resilience. If you think every sentence has to be architecturally flawless before it leaves your mouth, you will simply never speak.
That is an interesting point, though I would reframe the root cause of that hesitation. The hesitation you describe isn't caused by knowing the rules. It is caused by not having internalized those rules through adequate conscious practice, which leads right into our second major area of disagreement, the value of conscious drilling versus your concept of contextual phrase mining. You argue against drilling, but I strongly defend the deliberate practice of isolating and drilling power phrases.
Give me an example of a power phrase in this context.
These are highly functional, high-frequency sentence chunks. Phrases like, let me think for a second, or could you clarify that, or as far as I am concerned. Drilling these structures until they are completely automatic provides the speaker with a vital safety net. When your brain is overwhelmed by simultaneous translation tasks during a fast-paced conversation, having these pre-rehearsed chunks ready to deploy buys you precious time. It keeps the conversation flowing. Furthermore, the literature explicitly recommends writing out sentences using these targeted structures and having them corrected by a tutor. This active, conscious engagement with the mechanics of the language is vastly superior to the passive consumption of media you're advocating for.
I have to jump in here because I just don't buy that active conscious drilling is superior to immersive mining. Let me tell you why. Drilling isolated sentences out of a textbook completely strips the language of its most powerful mnemonic device, context. Let's introduce the neuroscience here, specifically hippocampal indexing theory.
The hippocampus being the brain's memory center.
Correct. The hippocampus encodes memories by linking sensory inputs. When you engage in phrase mining, say extracting a sentence from a compelling movie, a gripping book, or a podcast you love, you aren't just memorizing a string of text on a white page. You are indexing a moment. You are capturing the audio, the actor's facial expression, the emotional weight of the scene.
But is that emotion really scalable? Can you really rely on intense emotion to learn thousands of functional everyday sentence structures, whereas the bathroom doesn't usually carry a lot of cinematic weight?
It absolutely is scalable, because the emotion doesn't have to be a sweeping cinematic drama. It just has to be genuine interest or engagement. Consider the AJAT phenomenon in language learning circles, all Japanese all the time. These learners achieved near-native fluency not by drilling grammar tables, but by sentence mining media they genuinely loved. When a learner extracts a phrase from a piece of media they care about, that contextual engagement acts as a neuroadhesive. Research suggests this contextual binding makes the memory stick up to 5 times longer than an abstract, isolated rule learned from a textbook drill.
5 times longer?
Yes, because the retention recall for emotional, contextual phrases is staggeringly higher than for isolated vocabulary. Now, I will concede there is a danger here. Practitioners call it the hoarder trap. If a learner mines too many flashcards or makes the fatal mistake of isolating a single word and deleting the surrounding sentence, they destroy that vital context hook. But when done correctly, utilizing that N+1 rule so the cognitive load is manageable, phrase mining builds procedural memory. It builds the actual skill of using the language in a way that declarative drilling simply cannot match.
I hear the appeal of the neuroadhesive, but I am not convinced by that line of reasoning because it assumes the adult learner has infinite time to just sit around immersing themselves in media, waiting for the perfect N+1 sentences to appear organically. Busy adults do not have that luxury. Which brings us to the structure of the learning journey itself and our third point of contention, the natural order of acquisition versus structured syllabi. I argue for the undeniable efficacy of step-by-step structured learning.
Even if that structure contradicts how the brain naturally acquires language?
I don't believe it contradicts it at all. I believe it optimizes it for the adult schedule. Consider the highly effective 15-minute daily speaking routine designed specifically for busy adults. It is entirely structured. You spend the first 5 minutes physically and mentally warming up. You literally speak simple, familiar sentences out loud to get the mouth, the lips, and the tongue working around foreign phonemes.
Like a musician doing scales before performance?
Exactly. Speaking a foreign language requires using your facial muscles in entirely new ways. The next 5 minutes are dedicated to practicing specific sounds and clear pronunciation. You might read a text out loud and record it to catch errors. Only the last 5 minutes are devoted to free speaking. This breaks language acquisition down into manageable, logical, and highly disciplined blocks. For an adult juggling work, family, and a mortgage, this explicit structure is what ensures consistency. You cannot just tell a busy professional to go watch a foreign television show and hope they emotionally index the right phrases by osmosis.
The 15-minute routine is a fantastic habit-building tool. I won't deny that consistency is king, but its fundamental assumption that language can be logically sequenced and fed to the learner, block by block, violates cognitive biology. Let's look at Krashen's natural order hypothesis. This is deeply supported by the famous morpheme studies by Dooley and Burt.
Let's unpack the morpheme studies briefly for context so everyone is on the same page.
Sure. A morpheme is just the smallest unit of meaning in a language. For example, adding an S to a word to make it plural, or using ing for an ongoing action. Dooley and Burt found that all learners, regardless of their native language, acquire these features in a highly predictable biological sequence. And crucially, this biological order is entirely independent of how a syllabus is structured or how an explicit routine is planned.
But surely explicitly teaching a simple rule early on accelerates that natural order? If you point out the pattern, the adult brain can leverage it.
You would think so, but the data says it actually doesn't. Take the third person S in English, as in he runs or she talks. It is incredibly easy to explain declaratively. It takes 2 seconds. It is usually taught in week 1 of any beginner textbook. Yet biologically, it is not procedurally acquired by the brain until the very late stages of language acquisition. You can drill that S in your 15-minute routine for months, but in spontaneous free speaking, the learner will continually drop it until their brain is developmentally ready to acquire it.
So you were saying the explicit teaching is completely wasted?
I am saying massive, comprehensible input surrounding the brain with natural, context-rich language aligns with this biological order perfectly. The brain subconsciously sorts out the grammar when it receives enough data. Artificial lesson plans and logical syllabi try to force the brain to acquire features out of sequence. That is exactly why learners experience so much frustration. They can pass a written grammar test on Tuesday, but they freeze when trying to order a coffee on Wednesday. The declarative knowledge didn't translate to procedural still.
I understand the mechanics behind the natural order hypothesis, but I must push back on the implication that explicit instruction is therefore useless just because procedural fluency lags behind. Even if that third-person S is fully acquired later in spontaneous speech, the declarative knowledge of that rule acts as a monitor, to use another of Krashen's terms.
The internal editor.
Exactly. It acts as an internal editor. It allows the adult learner to self-correct during slower forms of communication. Think about writing an email or engaging in careful, deliberate speech. Having that explicit rule builds the exact confidence needed to engage in the very immersion you're suggesting. If they don't have the rule, they don't even know what to listen for in the input. They cannot mine a phrase effectively if they have no structural framework to understand why the phrase works in the first place.
The monitor is a valid concept, but even Krashen warns that overusing the monitor is exactly what causes the hesitation, the sweaty palms, and the fear we discussed earlier. If you are constantly monitoring, you aren't flowing. The entire goal of phrase mining is to bypass the monitor and build an intuitive feel for the language. When you expose yourself to thousands of correct patterns through compelling input, you don't need a declarative framework to know a sentence is correct. It simply sounds right, just as it does in your native language. You don't parse the grammar of your native tongue before you speak. You just speak.
But sounding right mentally requires the physical production apparatus to be trained. This is a crucial piece of the puzzle. That is why the physical component of the 15-minute routine, warming up the mouth, practicing the specific mechanical movements of pronunciation, is so critical. You can listen to 1,000 hours of native audio, but if you don't explicitly train the muscles in your mouth to produce those novel phonemes, you will retain a heavy accent and struggle with intelligibility. Production is fundamentally a motor skill, and motor skills require conscious, repetitive physical drilling.
I definitely agree that pronunciation has a motor component. Shadowing or mimicking native audio is a vital part of the communicative approach, but the core driver of what to say and how to construct the thought remains the procedural memory built by input. If we prioritize the rote memorization of grammar rules and isolated translations, we are preparing students for a 19th century Latin exam, not a 21st century globalized workplace.
Let's bring this together. We have covered a lot of ground today, from hippocampal indexing to the physical motor skills of speech. To summarize my stance, I maintain that the foundation of adult language acquisition must be built on declarative knowledge, structural drilling, and explicit error correction. The adult brain requires a safety net. By isolating high-value sentence structures, consciously practicing them, and utilizing highly disciplined routines like that 15-minute daily practice, learners build a robust framework.
This explicit structure does not hinder communication. Rather, it provides the necessary scaffolding that allows the adult learner to step into real-time conversations with accuracy and confidence, avoiding the pitfalls of cognitive illusions and fossilized errors.
And I will reaffirm my stance that true native-like communication is driven by procedural fluency, emotional context, and the lowering of the fear barrier. By engaging deeply with comprehensible input and utilizing methods like N+1 phrase mining, learners attach emotional neuroadhesive to vocabulary. This honors the biological realities of how the human brain naturally sequences language. Language is not a mathematical puzzle to be consciously decoded in real time. It is a subconscious skill to be acquired through rich, meaningful, and resilient communication.
Now, we definitely find common ground on consistency. Whether you are following a highly structured 15-minute speaking routine or dedicating daily time to immersive phrase mining, consistent daily exposure is vastly superior to sporadic binge learning. You cannot just cram on Sundays and expect to speak on Monday.
Absolutely. Small daily steps compound into massive cognitive restructuring. And I think we also entirely agree on the immense value of chunking. Whether you view them as pre-rehearsed power phrases to provide a safety net as you do, or as mind chunks of procedural input as I do, learning language in multi-word phrases rather than single isolated words is universally recognized as the best way to reduce cognitive load during real-time speech.
Agreed. But I still maintain that without a declarative framework, that daily exposure is highly inefficient. We may just have to agree to disagree on the necessity of the textbook and the drills.
And I'll continue to argue that the textbook is what's keeping them frozen at the coffee shop counter. But the brain is a remarkable engine, and understanding these different mechanisms only empowers the learner to experiment and find what truly unlocks their own fluency.
Indeed. The literature we have discussed today contains a wealth of specific phrases, routines, and frameworks. There is so much more to explore in the source material, and the most effective path forward likely depends heavily on the individual listener's own cognitive preferences and learning style. Thank you for joining us for this exchange today. We leave it to you to determine the best approach for your own language journey. Until next time.